Hi y'all, Sam here, lead teacher of ARC 201. This video is going to introduce you to Project 2. I'm going to lay out the main task that you'll be doing. I'm going to show you how to jump in and get started. And I'm going to go over the key terms that you need to know for Project 2. Those are daylight, enclosure, exploration, development, and internal logic. You need to understand these terms and you need to know how to apply them in order to be successful in this project. Project 2 is a study of interior daylight. And what I mean by that is that you will be designing an interior space only that is entirely illuminated by daylight or by light from the sun. Now, the maximum size of this space that you'll be designing is 30 feet by 30 feet by 30 feet. Now, it doesn't have to be this cube. It really shouldn't be that cube at all, but it just roughly has to fit inside that volume. Project 2, like I said, is entirely interior. So imagine that the outside of the project or the outside of the models that you make don't exist. And the only thing that exists outside the models is the sun and the sky and the ground that people travel on in order to enter your project. This project is situated at latitude 47.6, which is exactly where Seattle is. Where you are in the world, where you are on the globe, impacts how the sun tracks across the sky and thus how the daylight enters an interior space. We're not really going to worry about that too much in this project, but it's good to know. We're actually going to strip away a lot of the complexity that would be in a normal, built architectural project so that you can focus on working abstractly and getting into design in a poetic and beautiful way. So what you're primarily concerned with in this project, what you're mainly tasked with are two things. You're tasked with coming up with ideas that drive your design and making awesome graphics. You're going to be coming up with ideas by making physical models. The models you make are inspired by a verb in this list of verbs that's in the prompt. Now, to just get started, you just pick a verb, any verb that sort of seems promising or sparks some kind of inspiration, an idea in your head, and then you just start making and you see what happens. Let's just look at an example and I can explain this better. Okay, here we see two images of a student's model. We can see a color photograph of the outside of the model on the left. I know I just said the outside of the model doesn't exist. You need to take photos of the outside of the models just to help your teachers and classmates understand what you made. Really, the design work that you're doing is about the interior of these models. So on the right is a black and white interior photograph of the model. Above the model, it says to scatter. This is the verb that the student chose to explore. They made some slits in the enclosure that let in strips of light on the inside. You can see that. And then they put torn up or frayed pieces of cardboard on the inside just to start to scatter the light there. So we can see that the student used this verb as inspiration to get an idea that drives the design. But notice that the light is just barely scattered. Other than a couple of slits and a couple of pieces of torn cardboard, the rest of the model is kind of just a boring box, right? But there is this nugget of a cool idea in there that we can work with. So when you've got this nugget of an idea, the work you want to do is start to develop an internal logic. When a project feels cohesive and looks like the architecture was guided by a set of rules and everything just seems to make sense, we can say that it has internal logic. Let's look at another model that developed this same idea of to scatter. In this model, we can see that the little nugget of an idea developed into so much more. It's become how the enclosure lets in light all around, and it became the circulation path. All the parts of the project now seem to relate. They seem to be part of a family. So you can think of internal logic as these set of rules that you make up that guide your design decisions when it comes to the architectural aspects. In this example, the rule was ripping up cardboard and assembling it in a kind of rough way and letting in light, here and there and all around, and letting everything really just scatter, right? Because the verb we started with was to scatter. So the light in the enclosure is scattered. And notice how even the circulation feels kind of scattered. So this whole project really feels like to scatter. To get to this place in the design process where things are starting to make sense, they're starting to relate, and there's an overall cohesion to everything you're looking at, to the whole design. To get to this place, it does not come right away, and it shouldn't come right away. You shouldn't have everything all worked out in your head before you start making something, because the whole point of the design process is to go through some exploration and discovery to learn what needs to happen to make the project come together. So you make exploratory models and you study them, you reflect on them, and through that you discover things about those models, and you may make another model, and you just build on that and start developing this project. But yet it's not all worked out in my head when I start designing a project. I really just try to cut away all the fluff and all the complexity and get to what I think is sort of essential, and start playing around. And when I start playing around, then I'm getting into this exploratory process where I can go somewhere and find something out about the project. It's likely that your early models are going to be like this box, and then you've got a cool thing that you did to that box. That is the verb that you worked on. And then you'll jump into Photoshop and you'll pop in a scaled figure, and voila, architecture. But notice when you get to that point that it's kind of just a box with a cool thing. And that cool thing is your nugget of an idea. That's what you want to develop and kind of blossom into this whole architecture project where the cool idea is informing everything and shaping the whole project. It's not this isolated moment in what is otherwise kind of a simple box. Okay, I've mentioned all these other key terms already without explaining them. So let's loop back and explain these key terms for this project. If you remember from the architectural aspects video, enclosure is related to space and form. So enclosure is what surrounds the space. It's essentially the form that wraps around the space. We tend to talk about enclosure as being on a spectrum. There are degrees of enclosure from completely closed off and dark to fully open and everything that's in between. The key thing to think about and apply for project 2 is that you'll be using the enclosure as a way to control the daylight. So you'll be either making openings in the enclosure, or you'll be assembling the enclosure in some way to let in light and kind of hold that space. And finally, we come to daylight, the conceptual glue of this project. Daylight is absolutely an essential part of the experience of architecture because it animates architecture. It brings architecture to life. Light has direction, it has intensity, and it has color. For direction, pay attention to the source of the light coming into the space and where it's coming from. For intensity, pay attention to whether you want the light to be soft, dull, and dim, or maybe bright, strong, and bold. Light is also always in relationship to shade and shadow. It's not just light itself, it's how it relates to the shade and shadow that animates architecture and evokes certain moods. For project 2, you'll be working with direction and intensity, but you won't really be working with the color of light. This project is going to be rendered in black and white, and this allows you to completely devote your attention to the light and shade and shadow that animates architectural space. Light comes from the sun. So in this project, you're only working with the light from the sun. Project 2 is set in Seattle, which is the northern hemisphere. In the northern hemisphere, the sun tracks across the southern part of the sky. It's great if you can take your models outside whenever the outside conditions allow you, but I know that can't always happen. So if you can't go outside, you can use an electric light to illuminate your model from the inside. You may use your phone, although you do need something to take pictures with, so a flashlight or something else. And when you use a light source, you want to be thinking about this light source as the sun, so tracking across a part of the sky. So the sun is never going to be below the model, shooting direct light up into space. It's always going to be bringing that light in somewhere above. There are two main ways that light can be brought into an interior space, either direct light or indirect light. Direct daylight is the light from the sun that makes it directly into an interior space. You could look through the opening in the enclosure and you can see the source of the light directly. You could look directly at the sun, but of course don't do that. Direct light is strong. It's got crisp edges between the light and the shade. The Pantheon is an ancient example of direct light. Right? It comes in through a hole or an oculus right in the center of that domed roof. And if you studied this in the ancient architecture history course, you may have gotten into, the ideas driving this design, this approach to daylight. So why is there a hole right in the center? What did this symbolize to the Romans? What was the purpose of the Pantheon? You could actually mark the passage of time using this oculus as it tracks its way across the building throughout the day. Really beautiful example of how dynamic daylight is. A modern example would be the Farnsworth house. Light enters the Farnsworth house mostly as direct light. This is in contrast to indirect light, which bounces or filters off of a surface before it illuminates an interior space. With indirect light, you're not able to see the source of the light. You can't look directly through the opening and see the sun. This makes the light more mysterious. It's unknown exactly where it's coming from. Indirect light is softer. You can't often see the crisp edge between the light and the shade. They're usually softer fades. A good example of indirect light is a project by a UW graduate, Stephen Hull. This is the St. Ignatius Chapel here in Seattle. The architect wanted natural light to bounce off of peeled back and carved surfaces and softly illuminate the interior of this religious space. Notice how you cannot directly see the sun or the crisp edge of the sunlight. You just see the natural light washing over the interior surfaces. Architects have put endless effort into studying how daylight enters interior space. Look at these sectional diagrams that show daylight being brought inside through all different types of openings in the enclosure. Some are direct, some are indirect, some are in the roof, some are in the walls. When you're making models, play around with making the light come in both directly and indirectly. This video covers a lot of what's in the written and graphic instructions on the project prompt that'll be available in your section's Moreau board. There's a schedule that details what you're working on when and shows examples of the kind of work we're expecting. We've mapped out what we think is an ambitious but manageable workload. We know you all have a lot going on, so if you are struggling to manage, please reach out to your teachers for support. What we're trying to do here is push you to learn and grow and work hard, but of course we don't want to make you miserable. So let's talk about how to start project 2. These are not buildings. You are not making buildings. It's more abstract than that. Think of these as light enclosures. There's no doors, there's no windows, there's no furniture. These are just forms that you make that hold space and light. You know, these early models that you make, you can kind of think of them as sculptures. They're cool, interesting, weird sculptures. So let's strip away a little bit more, just right at the beginning, these first early models that you make. Don't worry about the scale of things right when you're starting to make. Don't worry about the circulation, the paths or the stairs or whatever. Just put that stuff aside. Don't worry about it yet. Just imagine these enclosures and how they bring in light. That's where you want to start. So begin by looking through that list of verbs that's in the prompt on the Moreau board. Pick one that sparks an idea, inspires some kind of image in your mind. If you get a little flash of something cool, follow that flash. Make it into a model. You can either start by sketching the idea or jumping right into modeling. This is where the design exploration process begins. So after this video wraps up, watch the exploration video to get a deeper explanation and to see me actually go through the exploration process. With each model you make, take a color photo of the outside and a black and white photo of the interior. Bring the interior photo into Photoshop and adjust the levels to get a full range of tone from pure white to pure black. This adds more drama and depth to these images. It'll be really fun to look at them in class. For two of the black and white photos, now add some scaled figures. These will make the images have a sense of scale and they'll give a purpose to that space. Is that space to sort of stand in and look up at the filtered light as it washes down a column of crumpled fabric? Or maybe it's a place to put your hand out and catch the raindrops and see the soft light illuminate the palm of your hand. I just want to reiterate that starting is hard. It's hard as a beginning designer. It's hard as an experienced designer. I think a big thing to remember is don't think too much. Don't try to solve all the problems in your head before you make something. Really just look for some quick inspiration to get you going, and that will build momentum and that will start building the exploration process. And through that, you'll start to solve the problems. You'll start to answer the questions. You'll start to see things that look beautiful that you want to enhance and develop. So on that note of it being hard to start, I just want to say it's okay to start with boxes that have a little cool thing going on. Start with something you know. Start with something that's familiar. And just know that by the end of this project, having gone through this exploration process and discovered all sorts of stuff about your ideas, you'll be thinking and making more abstractly. You'll be making these enclosures for daylight that can break the rules of what a typical building looks like and feels like. So you don't have to be worrying about walls and floors and roofs and windows. None of that stuff exists in this project. The walking surface doesn't have to be flat. It doesn't even have to be walkable. You could have it be some kind of surface or surfaces where you have to climb or crawl or jump in order to circulate through the space. Is there even a roof, or are there even walls in this project? Or does the enclosure just wrap up or fold or crumple in on itself to be able to solve the problems of this project? Who knows? The point is to think abstractly so that you can develop a main idea and create an internal logic. I've said develop and developing and development, I don't know, maybe 40 times over this video. Who knows? But I haven't explained it yet. It really just means taking that nugget of an idea. You know, in the case, maybe you made a box with a cool thing going on, and that cool thing was inspired by the verb. Developing it just means taking that nugget, expanding it, letting it blossom, and having it become the whole project. By developing a project, you're allowing the ideas to address all the architectural aspects that you need to consider in that project. So for project 2, you're considering daylight and enclosure and circulation. So when you develop the project, you're using your main idea to address those things and solve whatever problems seem to be coming up as you're modeling, as you're exploring. As this project progresses, we'll go over detailed expectations of what's due when, and we'll show you more work examples to help guide your process. That's all for the introduction to Project 2 for now. I hope this video provided some clarity on how to jump into Project 2 and get started. And I also hope it inspired you in some way about architectural design.